Beyond the pleasure principle. Sigmund Freud. Beyond the pleasure principle. 1. In psychoanalytic theory we unreservedly adopt the assumption that the course of mental processes is automatically regulated by the pleasure principle. That is to say, we believe that in all cases it is set in motion by an unpleasant tension, and then it adopts such an orientation that its final result coincides with a decrease in that tension, that is, with an avoidance of unpleasantness or a production of pleasure. When we consider the psychic processes we have studied with reference to this course, we introduce the economic point of view into our work. In our opinion, an exposition that, in addition to the topical and dynamic aspects, tries to appreciate this other aspect, the economic one, is the most complete that we can conceive for the moment and deserves to be distinguished under the name of metapsychological exposition 1. In all this, it is of no interest to us to investigate whether our thesis of the pleasure principle brings us closer to or affiliates us with a certain philosophical system formulated in history. It is that we have arrived at such speculative assumptions as a result of our effort to describe and assess the facts of daily observation in our field. Neither priority nor originality are counted among the objectives that psychoanalytic work has set itself, and the impressions that serve as support for the formulation of this principle are so clear that they could hardly be ignored. On the other hand, we would be willing to admit the precedence of a philosophical or psychological theory that knows how to indicate the meanings of the sensations of pleasure and displeasure, so imperative for us. Unfortunately, nothing usable is offered to us on this point. It is the darkest and most inaccessible realm of mental life and, since we cannot avoid touching it, I believe that the most lax hypothesis we adopt will be the best. We have resolved to refer pleasure and displeasure to the amount of excitation present in mental life, and not linked in any way. Thus, displeasure corresponds to an increase in that amount, and pleasure to a reduction of it. We do not have in mind a simple relation between the intensity of such sensations and those alterations to which we refer them, even less, as all the experiences of psychophysiology teach, a direct proportionality. The deciding factor in sensation is probably the measure of increase or decrease over a period of time. It is possible that experimentation can contribute something at this point, but for us analysts it is not advisable to delve further into this problem until very precise observations can serve as a guide. Now then, it cannot be indifferent to us to find that a researcher as penetrating as G.T. Fechner has supported, on pleasure and displeasure, a concept that essentially coincides with the one imposed on us by psychoanalytic work. Fechner's statement is contained in his booklet Einige den Entwicklungsgeschichte der Organismen, 1873, Part 11, Supplement, p. 94, and reads as follows: Since conscious impulses are always linked with a pleasure or a displeasure, the latter can be conceived as referring, in psychophysical terms, to proportions of stability or instability, and on this can be based the hypothesis that I will develop in more detail elsewhere, according to which any psychophysical movement that crosses the threshold of consciousness is affected by pleasure to the extent that it approaches, beyond a certain border, stability. Full, and affected by displeasure to the extent that beyond a certain border it deviates from that, existing between both borders, which must be characterized as qualitative thresholds of pleasure and displeasure, a certain margin of aesthetic indifference. 4. The facts that led us to believe that the pleasure principle governs mental life find their expression also in the hypothesis that the mental apparatus strives to keep as low as possible, or at least constant, the amount of excitation present in it. This is equivalent to saying the same thing, only in a different way, because if the work of the mental apparatus is determined to keep the amount of excitement low, everything that is apt to increase it will be felt as dysfunctional, that is to say, unpleasant. The pleasure principle is derived from the constancy principle. In reality, the constancy principle 5 was discerned from the facts that imposed on us the hypothesis of the pleasure principle. On the other hand, in a more in-depth analysis we will discover that this eagerness, assumed by us, of the mental apparatus is subordinated as a special case under Fechner's principle of the tendency to stability, to which he referred the sensations of pleasure and displeasure. But then we must say that, in truth, it is incorrect to speak of an empire of the pleasure principle over the course of mental processes. If this were the case, the overwhelming majority of our mental processes would have to be accompanied by or lead to pleasure, and the most universal experience strongly refutes this conclusion. Therefore, the situation cannot be other than this: in the soul there is a strong tendency towards the pleasure principle, but certain other forces or constellations, they annoy it, so that the final result cannot always correspond to the tendency to pleasure. Compare Fechner's 1873, p. 90, remark on a similar problem. But since the striving for the goal does not yet mean its achievement, and in general this goal can only be reached by approximations. If we now turn to the question about the circumstances capable of preventing the pleasure principle from prevailing, we once again step on safe and familiar ground, and to give the answer we can adduce in excess of our analytic experiences. The first case of such an inhibition of the pleasure principle is familiar to us. It has the character of a law, Gesetzmäßig. We know that the pleasure principle is proper to a primary mode of work of the psychic apparatus, unusable from the very beginning, and even dangerous to a high degree, for the self-preservation of the organism in the midst of the difficulties of the external world. Under the influence of the self-preservation drives of the ego, it is relieved by the reality principle 6, which, without resigning the purpose of a final gain of pleasure, demands and succeeds in postponing satisfaction, renouncing various possibilities of achieving it, and provisionally tolerate displeasure in the long detour to pleasure. Now, the pleasure principle still remains for a long time the mode of work of the sexual drives, difficult to educate, and it happens again and again that, it is since the latter, be it within the self itself, prevails over the reality principle to the detriment of the organism as a whole. There is no doubt, however, that the replacement of the pleasure principle by the reality principle can be held responsible for only a small part, and not the most intense, of the experiences of unpleasure. Another source of the detachment of displeasure, no less subject to law, arises from the conflicts and splits produced in the mental apparatus while the ego goes through its development towards organizations of higher complexity. Almost all the energy that fills the apparatus comes from the congenital instinctual movements, but they are not all admitted in the same phase of development. In the course of this, it repeatedly happens that certain drives or parts of drives show themselves, due to their goals or their requirements, irreconcilable with the rest that can be conjugated in the encompassing unit of the ego. They are then segregated from that unit by the process of repression, they are retained in lower stages of psychic development, and the possibility of attaining satisfaction is initially cut off from them. And if they then manage, as so easily happens in the case of repressed sexual drives, to obtain direct or substitute satisfaction through certain indirect ions, this success, which would normally have been a possibility of pleasure, is felt by the ego as displeasure. As a result of the old conflict that led to repression, the pleasure principle experiences another rupture just at the moment when certain drives were working to gain a new pleasure in obedience to that principle. The details of the process by which repression transforms a possibility of pleasure into a source of displeasure are not yet fully intelligible or cannot be clearly stated, but surely all neurotic displeasure is of that kind, a pleasure that cannot be felt as such. The two sources of displeasure that we have indicated are far from covering most of our experiences of displeasure, but of the rest it can be affirmed, with overtones of justification, that their existence does not contradict the rule of the pleasure principle. For the most part, the unpleasantness we feel is a perceived unpleasantness. It may be the perception of the effort of unsatisfied drives, or an exterior perception that is painful in itself or that excites unpleasant expectations in the mental apparatus, as it is discerned as danger. The reaction to these instinctual demands and threats of danger, a reaction in which the genuine activity of the psychic apparatus is externalized, can then be correctly conducted by the pleasure principle or by the reality principle, which modifies it. It does not seem then necessary to admit a considerable restriction of the pleasure principle. However, precisely the investigation of the psychic reaction to external danger can provide new material and new approaches in relation to the problem at hand. 2. The description of a state that occurs after mechanical concussions, railway collisions, and other accidents that entailed risk of death is already of old data, for which reason the name traumatic neurosis has remained. The horrible war that has just ended caused it in great numbers, and at least put an end to the attempt to attribute it to an organic deterioration of the nervous system through the action of mechanical violence. The picture of traumatic neurosis is close to that of hysteria by presenting in abundance similar motor symptoms, but it surpasses it, as a rule, in its very pronounced indications of subjective suffering, which resemble it to a hypochondria or a melancholy dash, as well as in the evidence of a much more vast general weakening and destruction of the psychic operations. Until now, full knowledge of war neuroses and traumatic neuroses in peacetime has not been achieved. In the case of the former, it was enlightening on the one hand, although on the other it confused things again. The fact that the same pathological picture occurred on occasions without the cooperation of crude mechanical violence. In common traumatic neurosis, two features stand out that could be taken as a starting point for reflection: that the center of gravity of the causation seems to be located in the factor of surprise, in terror, and that a simultaneous physical damage or injury counteracts in most cases production of neurosis. Terror, fear, anguish, are mistakenly used as synonymous expressions. They can be distinguished very well in their relation to danger. Anxiety designates a certain state of expectation in the face of danger and preparation for it, even if it is an unknown danger. Fear requires a certain object, in the presence of which one feels it. On the other hand, the state in which one falls when a danger is run without being prepared is called terror. The surprise factor stands out. I do not believe that anxiety can produce a traumatic neurosis. There is something in anxiety that protects against terror and therefore also against terror neurosis. We will return to this thesis later. Cf. AE 18, p. 3110. It is legitimate for us to consider the study of dreams as the most reliable way to explore deep psychic processes. Now, the dream life of traumatic neurosis shows this character. It brings the patient back again and again to the situation of his accident, from which he awakens with renewed terror. This is not surprising enough. It is believed that if the traumatic event haunts you continuously while you sleep, this proves the strength of the impression it made on you. The patient, it is maintained, is, so to speak, psychically fixed to the trauma. Such fixations on the experience that triggered the disease have long been known to us in hysteria. Brewer and Freud stated in 189,311 that the hysteric suffers from most reminiscences. Also with regard to shell neuroses, observers such as Ferenczi and Simmel explained many motor symptoms by a fixation at the time of the trauma. However, I have not heard that patients with traumatic neurosis frequently recall their accident in waking life. Perhaps they try harder not to think about him. When it is admitted as obvious that the night's sleep brings them back to the pathogenic situation, the nature of the dream is unknown. More typical of this would be to present the patient with images of the time when he was healthy, or of his expected cure. Assuming that the dreams of these traumatic neurotics do not dissuade us from affirming that the tendency of the dream is the fulfillment of a wish, perhaps we are left with the expedient to maintain that in this state the function of the dream, like so many other things, was affected and diverted from its purposes, or we would have to think about the enigmatic masochistic tendencies of the ego 12. Now I propose to abandon the obscure and arid subject of traumatic neurosis and study the mode of work of the mental apparatus in one of its earliest normal practices. I mean children's game. Recently, S. Pfeiffer, 1919, has offered a psychoanalytic summary and appreciation of the various theories of children's play. I can refer here to your work. These theories strive to deduce the motives that lead the child to play, but they do not give precedence to the economic point of view, that is, considering the gain of pleasure. For my part, and without pretending to cover all of these phenomena, I have taken advantage of an opportunity that was offered to me to clarify the first self-created game of a 1.5-year-old boy. It was more than an observation made in passing, since I lived for a few weeks with the child and his parents under the same roof, and it took a long time before this enigmatic and continuously repeated action revealed its meaning to me. The boy's intellectual development was by no means precocious. At a year and a half, he pronounced only a few intelligible words and also had several significant sounds, understood by those around him. But he had a good relationship with his parents and the only girl on duty, and they praised his judicious character. He did not bother his parents at night, he scrupulously obeyed the prohibitions against touching certain objects and going to certain places, and, above all, he did not cry when his mother left him for hours, this last despite the fact that he felt great tenderness for her, who had not only nursed him by herself, but had cared for and raised him without the help of others. Now, this good boy exhibited the habit, annoying at times, of throwing away from himself, in a corner or under a bed, etc., all the small objects that he found within his reach, so that it was usually not an easy task. Gather their toys, and as he did so he would utter, with an expression of interest and satisfaction, a loud and prolonged "oocio," which, in the concurring judgment of the mother and this observer, was not an interjection, but meant for it. He went away. I finally realized that it was a game and that the boy had no other use for his toys than to play going away. One day I made the observation that corroborated my point of view. The boy had a wooden spool tied with a string. It did not occur to him, for example, to drag it behind him across the floor to play card, but rather with great dexterity he would throw the reel, which he held by the string, behind the railing of his crib with mosquito netting. The spool would disappear in there, the child would pronounce its significant "oh," and then, pulling the string, he would take the spool out of the cradle again, now greeting its appearance with a friendly "duh, here it is." That was it, then. The complete game, the game of disappearing and returning. Most of the time it had only been possible to see the first act, tirelessly repeated by itself as a game, although the greatest pleasure, without a doubt, corresponded to the second. The interpretation of the game was then obvious. It was intertwined with the child's great cultural achievement, his instinctual resignation, renunciation of instinctual satisfaction, to admit the mother's departure without protest. He compensated himself, let's say, by staging for himself, with the objects within his reach, that disappearance and return. For the effective evaluation of this game, it does not matter, of course, that the child himself invented it or appropriated it as a result of an external incitement. Our interest will turn to another point. It is impossible that the mother's departure was pleasant to him, or even indifferent. So, how is it reconciled with the pleasure principle that he repeats this painful experience for him as a game? Perhaps it will be answered that he played the game because it was the precondition of the joyous reappearance, which would contain the genuine purpose of the game. But it is contradicted by the observation that the first act, that of the game, was staged by itself, and indeed often incomparably more often than the entire game carried to its pleasant conclusion. The analysis of a single case of this nature does not allow us to settle the issue with certainty. If we consider it without warning, we get the impression that the child turned this experience into a game for another reason. In the experience he was passive, he was affected by it, now he took an active role repeating it as a game, even though it was unpleasant. This eagerness could be attributed to a drive to seize that acted regardless of whether the memory itself was pleasant or not. But another interpretation can also be tried. The act of throwing the object to go away was perhaps the satisfaction of an impulse, suppressed by the child in his behavior, to take revenge on the mother for his departure. Thus it would come to have this arrogant meaning, well, go then, I don't need you, I miss you myself. This same child whose first game I observed when he was a year and a half used to throw a toy he had been irritated with on the ground a year later, saying, "Go to war, R.A." He had been told by then that his absent father was away at war, and he certainly did not miss him, but gave the clearest indications of not wanting to be disturbed in his exclusive possession of the mother. We also know of other children that they are capable of expressing similar hostile motions by throwing objects instead of people. 15. This is how this question arises: can the Drang effort to psychically process something impressive, to fully seize it, be externalized primarily and independently of the pleasure principle? In any case, if in the case under examination this effort repeated an unpleasant impression in the game, this was only because the repetition was connected to a gain of pleasure of another, but direct kind. However, the study of children's play, no matter how much we deepen it, will not remedy our fluctuation between two conceptions. It is noticed that children repeat in play everything that has made a great impression on them in life. In this way they abreact the intensity of the impression and take possession, as it were, of the situation. But, on the other hand, it is quite clear that all their games are governed by the dominant desire in the stage in which they find themselves, to be great and to be able to act like the greatest. It is also observed that the unpleasant nature of the experience does not always make it unusable for the game. If the doctor examines the child's throat or performs a minor operation, this terrifying experience will surely become the content of the next game. But the gain of pleasure that comes from another source is obvious here. As soon as the child exchanges the passivity of experiencing for the activity of playing, he inflicts on a playmate the unpleasantness that happened to himself and thus takes revenge on this look-alike. Be that as it may, it turns out from these elucidations that it is superfluous for them to suppose a particular imitation drive as the motive for playing. A few thoughts to finish: the artistic play 17 and imitation practiced by adults, which, unlike the behavior of the child, aim at the person of the spectator, do not spare the latter the most painful impressions. In tragedy, for example, they do not, notwithstanding which he can feel them as a high enjoyment 18. Thus we are convinced that even under the rule of the pleasure principle there are sufficient means and ways to convert what is unpleasant in itself into an object of memory and psychic elaboration. An economically inspired aesthetic should deal with these cases and situations that lead to a final gain of pleasure, but they are of no use to us for our purpose, since they presuppose the existence and rule of the pleasure principle and do not attest to the action of tendencies situated beyond it, that is to say, tendencies that would be more original than the pleasure principle and independent of it. Point 3. 25 years of intense work have meant that the immediate goals of psychoanalytic technique are entirely different today than at the beginning. At that time, the doctor dedicated to analysis could have no other aspiration than that of collecting, reconstructing, and communicating at the opportune moment the unconscious hidden from the patient. Psychoanalysis was above all an art of interpretation. But since the therapeutic task was not solved in this way, another immediate purpose was immediately set: to urge the patient to corroborate the construction through his own memory. As a result of this effort, the center of gravity fell on the resistance of that one. The art now consisted in discovering them as soon as possible, in showing them to him and, through human influence, this was the place of suggestion, which acted as transference, in moving him to resign them. Later, however, it became increasingly clear that the proposed goal, the becoming conscious of the unconscious, could not be fully achieved by this path either. The patient may not remember everything that is repressed in him, perhaps just the essentials. If this happens, he does not acquire any conviction about the correctness of the construction that was communicated to him. Rather, he is forced to repeat what is repressed as a present experience, instead of remembering it, as the doctor would prefer, as a fragment of the past 19. This reproduction, which emerges with unwanted fidelity, always has as its content a fragment of childhood sexual life and, therefore, of the Oedipus complex and its ramifications, and regularly it is played as staged in the field of transference, that is, of the relationship with the doctor. When things have been brought to this point in treatment, it can be said that the old neurosis has been replaced by a new one, a transference neurosis. The doctor has endeavored to restrict the field of this transference neurosis as much as possible, to make the greatest effort to remember and admit the minimum repetition. The ratio established between memory and reproduction is different in each case. In general, the doctor cannot spare the patient this phase of the treatment. He has to let him relive a certain fragment of his forgotten life, taking care that while doing so he retains a certain degree of reflection by virtue of which that apparent reality can be individualized each time as a reflection of a forgotten past. This will have won the patient's conviction and the therapeutic success that depends on it. In order to make this repetition compulsion, which manifests itself in the course of the psychoanalytic treatment of neurotics, more intelligible, it is first of all necessary to get rid of an error, namely that in the fight against resistances one is faced with the resistance of the unconscious. The unconscious, that is to say, the repressed, offers no resistance to the efforts of the cure, and still does not aspire to anything other than breaking into consciousness despite the pressure that oppresses it, or even discharge through real action. The resistance in the cure comes from the same strata and superior systems of psychic life that at the time carried out the repression. But, since the reasons for the resistances, and even these themselves, are at the beginning unconscious in the treatment, as experience teaches us, this warns us that we have to correct a mistake in our terminology. We eliminate this darkness by setting in opposition, not the conscious and the unconscious, but the coherent self and the repressed. It is that without a doubt also within the ego there is a lot of the unconscious, precisely what can be called the nucleus of the ego. 21. We cover only a small part of it under the name of the preconscious. After thus substituting a merely descriptive terminology for a systematic or dynamic one, we can say that the resistance of the analysand starts from his ego. Having done this, we immediately realize that we must ascribe the repetition compulsion to the repressed unconscious. It is probable that it cannot be externalized before the work requesting the cure has loosened the repression. There is no doubt that the resistance of the conscious and preconscious ego is at the service of the pleasure principle. In effect, he wants to save the unpleasure that would be aroused by the liberation of the repressed, while we endeavor to ensure that this unpleasure is tolerated by invoking the reality principle. Now, what relationship does the compulsion to repeat, the forced externalization of what is repressed, have with the pleasure principle? It is clear that, more often than not, what the compulsion to repeat cannot but cause displeasure to the ego, since it brings to light operations of repressed instinctual motions. However, we have already considered this kind of displeasure. It does not contradict the pleasure principle, it is displeasure for one system and, at the same time, satisfaction for the other. 25. But the new and astonishing fact that we must now describe is that the repetition compulsion also brings back past experiences that contain no possibility of pleasure, which could not have been satisfactions at that time either, not even of the instinctual impulses that have been repressed since then. The early flowering of the child's sexual life was destined to be buried untergang because his desires were irreconcilable with reality and because of the inadequacy of the evolutionary stage in which the child found himself. That flowering collapsed Zugrundgehen as a result of the most painful occasions and in the midst of deeply painful sensations. Loss of love and failure left permanent damage to the feeling of self as a sequel, as a narcissistic scar, which, both according to my experiences and according to Marcinowski's, 1918, remarks, is the most powerful contribution to the frequent feeling of inferiority of neurotics. The sexual investigation, which collided with the barrier of the child's bodily development, did not obtain a satisfactory conclusion, hence the subsequent complaint, "I can't accomplish anything, nothing works out for me." The tender bond almost always established with the parent of the other sex succumbed to disappointment, to the vain expectation of satisfaction, to the jealousy caused by the birth of a little brother, indubitable proof of the infidelity of the beloved or the beloved, his own attempt, undertaken with tragic earnestness, to make such a son himself, failed shamefully, the withdrawal of tenderness lavished on the little boy, the increasing demand of education, serious words, and an occasional punishment. They had ended by revealing to him the full extent of the rebuff they were reserving for him. Thus the typical love of childhood comes to an end, its decline responds to a few types, which appear regularly. Now, in the transference, neurotics repeat all these unwanted occasions and these painful affective situations, reanimating them with great skill. They strive to interrupt the incomplete cure, they know how to get the impression of rebuff again, they force the doctor to speak harsh words to them and to behave coldly with them, they find the appropriate objects for their jealousy, they substitute the long-awaited son of primordial time for the design or the promise of a great gift, almost always as unreal as that one. None of that could have given pleasure then. It would be believed that today it would produce less unpleasantness if it emerged as a memory or in dreams, instead of taking shape as a new experience. It is, of course, the action of drives that were destined to lead to satisfaction, but at that moment they did not produce it, but only brought displeasure. That experience was made in vain. 26. It is repeated in spite of everything, a compulsion forces it. The same thing that psychoanalysis reveals in the transference phenomena of neurotics can also be found in the lives of non-neurotic people. In these, he gives the impression of a destiny that pursued them, of a demonic bias in his experience, and from the beginning psychoanalysis judged that this fatal destiny was self-induced and determined by influences from early childhood. The compulsion thus manifested is not different from the repetition compulsion of neurotics, despite the fact that such persons have never exhibited the signs of a neurotic conflict process through symptom formation. Individuals are known in whom every human relationship leads to the same outcome, benefactors whose protégés, no matter how dissimilar they may be in the rest, show themselves ungrateful after a certain time, and then they seem destined to exhaust the bitterness of ingratitude entirely, men in whom all friendship ends with the betrayal of the friend, others who in their lives repeat countless times the act of elevating a person to the status of eminent authority for themselves or even for the public, and after the designated period dethrone them to replace them with a new one, lovers whose tender relationship with the woman always goes through the same phases and ends in the same end, etc. This eternal return of the same hardly surprises us when it comes to the active behavior of such people, and we can discover the character trait that remains the same in them, forcibly externalizing itself in the repetition of identical experiences. We are much more surprised by the cases in which the person seems to passively experience something removed from his power, in spite of which he experiences the repetition of the same fate over and over again. Think, for example, of the story of that woman who was married 3 times in succession, and each time her husband fell ill and she had to take care of him on his deathbed. 27. The most touching poetic figuration of a fatal destiny like this was offered by Tasso in his romantic epic, Jerusalem Liberated. The hero, Tancredo, unknowingly killed his beloved Clorinda when she defied him clad in the armor of an enemy knight. Already buried, Tancredo enters an ominous enchanted forest, which terrifies the army of the Crusaders. There he splits a tall tree with his sword, but from the tree's wound blood flows, and the voice of Clorinda, whose soul was imprisoned in it, reproaches him for hurting his beloved again. In view of these observations concerning the behavior during the transference and the fatal destiny of human beings, we dare to assume that in mental life there really is a repetition compulsion that is established beyond the pleasure principle. And now we will be inclined to refer to it the dreams of patients with dramatic neurosis and the impulse to play in the child. We must admit, it is true, that only in rare cases can we apprehend purely, without the interference of other motives, the effects of the compulsion to repeat. Regarding children's play, we have already highlighted the other interpretations that its genesis admits. Repetition compulsion and direct pleasurable drive satisfaction seem to be intertwined in an intimate community. As to the phenomena of the transference, it is evident that they are at the service of the resistance of the ego. Obstinate in the repression, it would be said that the compulsion to repeat, which the cure intended to put at its service, is won over to the side of the ego, which wants to cling to the pleasure principle. 28. And as to what might be called the compulsion of fate, it seems to us largely explicable by weighting adjusted to the ratio rationellere Wugung, so that the need to postulate a new and mysterious motive is not felt. The least doubtful case is perhaps that of traumatic dreams, but on closer reflection it must be admitted that in the other examples, too, the motifs with which we are familiar do not fully encompass the constellation of facts. What remains is enough to justify the hypothesis of the compulsion to repeat, and this appears to us as more original, more elemental, more instinctual 29 than the pleasure principle that it dethrones. Now, if such a compulsion to repeat exists in the psychic, we would like to know something about the function that corresponds to it, the conditions under which it can emerge and the relationship it maintains with the pleasure principle, which until today, in truth, we had attributed the empire over the course of the processes of excitation in the mental life. 4. What follows is speculation, often far-reaching, that everyone will appreciate or disdain according to their subjective position. It is also an attempt to consistently exploit an idea, out of curiosity to know where it leads. Psychoanalytic speculation stems from the impression, received as a result of the investigation of unconscious processes, that consciousness cannot be the most universal character of mental processes, but only a particular function of them. In metapsychological terminology, he maintains that consciousness is the operation of a particular system, which he calls CC30. Since consciousness essentially provides perceptions of excitations coming from the outside world, and sensations of pleasure and displeasure that can only originate within the mental apparatus, it is possible to attribute a spatial position to the PCC system. It has to be found on the border between the exterior and the interior, facing the exterior world and involving the other psychic systems. Thus we come to the realization that with these hypotheses we have not tried something new, but rather followed the traces of localizing brain anatomy that places the seat of consciousness in the cortex of the brain, in the outermost, enveloping layer of the organ. Central. Brain anatomy need not concern itself with the reason why, put in anatomical terms, consciousness is located right on the surface of the brain, instead of being lodged somewhere else, in the recesses of it. Perhaps we, with respect to our PCC31 system, can go further in deducing that location. Consciousness is not the only property that we ascribe to the processes of that system. We only rely on the impressions that our psychoanalytic experience gives us if we adopt the hypothesis that all the excitatory processes of the other systems leave behind permanent traces that are the basis of memory, that is, mnemic remains that have nothing to do with them. Do with becoming conscious. Often the strongest and most enduring are those left behind by a process that never reached consciousness. Well, it is hard for us to believe that these permanent traces of excitation can also be produced in the PCC system. If they always remained conscious, they would very soon reduce the aptitude of the system for reception of new excitations, and if, on the contrary, they became unconscious, they would confront us with the task of explaining the existence of unconscious processes in a system whose functioning is generally accompanied by the phenomenon of consciousness. Then we would not have modified or gained anything, so to speak, with this hypothesis of ours by which we refer becoming conscious to a particular system. Although this consideration lacks conclusive logical force, it can lead us to conjecture that becoming conscious and leaving a memory trace are irreconcilable for the same system. Thus, we could say that in the CC system the excitatory process becomes conscious, but does not leave any lasting trace behind it. All the traces of that process, traces on which the memory is based, would be produced as a result of the propagation of the excitation to and in the contiguous internal systems. In this sense, I pointed out the scheme that I introduced in 1900 in the speculative chapter of the Interpretation of Dreams 33. If one considers how little we know from other sources about the genesis of consciousness, the following thesis will be attributed, at least, the value of an assertion that exhibits a certain precision: consciousness arises in replacement of the memory trace. The CC system would then be singled out for the particularity that in it, unlike what happens in all other psychic systems, the excitation process does not leave behind a permanent alteration of its elements, but exhausts itself, so to speak, in the phenomenon of becoming conscious. Such a deviation from the general rule asks to be explained by a factor that has exclusivity for this single system, and well, that factor that is missing from all the other systems could be the location of the CC system, which we have just exposed, its direct collision with the outside world. Let us represent the living organism in its maximum possible simplification, as an undifferentiated vesicle of stimulable substance, then its surface facing the outside world is differentiated by its very location and serves as a receptor organ for stimuli. And indeed embryology, as a recapitulation of evolutionary history, shows us that the central nervous system comes from the ectoderm. Be that as it may, the gray matter of the cortex is an offspring of the primitive surface and could have inherited essential properties from it. Thus, it would be easily conceivable that, due to the incessant impact of external stimuli on the surface of the vesicle, the substance of the vesicle would be altered to a certain depth, so that its excitatory process would run differently than in deeper layers. In this way, a cortex would have been formed, so sifted at the end of the process by the action of the stimuli, that it offers the most favorable conditions for receiving them and is no longer susceptible to further modification. Transferred to the CC system, this would mean that the excitation step can no longer cause any permanent alteration to its elements. They are modified to the maximum in the sense of this effect, thus being able to generate consciousness. What did this modification of the substance and of the excitatory process that runs within it consist of? We can only form diverse representations, all of them unverifiable for now. A possible assumption would be that in its advance from one element to the other, the excitation has to overcome a resistance, and precisely the reduction of this creates the permanent imprint of the excitation, facilitation. It could then be thought that in the CC system there is no longer any resistance of passage of this nature between one element and another. We could combine this image with Brewer's distinction between quiescent, bound, and freely mobile cathexis energy in the elements of psychic systems. The elements of the CC system would then not conduct any bound energy, but only an energy capable of free discharge. But I think that, provisionally, it is better to pronounce as vaguely as possible about these constellations. In short, through this speculation we would have somehow intertwined the genesis of consciousness with the location of the CC system and with the particularities attributable to its excitatory process. We still have to elucidate something about this living vesicle with its cortical layer that receives stimuli. This particle of living substance floats in the middle of an external world charged yet and with the most powerful energies, and would be annihilated by the action of the stimuli that depart from it if it were not provided with an anti-stimulus protection. It obtains it in the following way: its outermost surface ceases to have the structure proper to living matter, becomes inorganic, so to speak, and henceforth operates by separating stimuli, like a special envelope or membrane. That is to say, it means that now the energies of the external world can spread only with a fraction of their intensity to the contiguous strata, which remained alive. And these, shielded behind the anti-stimulus protection, can dedicate themselves to receiving the filtered stimulus volumes. Now, the external layer, when it died, preserved all the other, deeper layers, from suffering the same fate, at least until the moment when stimuli are so strong that they pierce the anti-stimulus protection. For the living organism, the task of protecting itself against stimuli is almost more important than that of receiving it. It is endowed with its own energy reserve, and particular forms of energy transformation unfold inside it. Its main desire must therefore be to preserve them from the leveling, and therefore destructive, influence of the hyper-great energies that work outside. The reception of stimuli serves above all the purpose of ascertaining the orientation and the nature of the external stimuli, and for this it must be enough to take small samples of the external world, to test it in small quantities. In the case of higher organisms, the stimulus-receiving cortical layer of the old vesicle long ago moved deep into the body, but parts of it were left behind on the surface, immediately beneath the general anti-stimulus protection. We are referring to the sensory organs, which essentially contain devices intended to receive specific stimulatory actions, but also particular preventive mechanisms for subsequent protection against hyper-large volumes of stimuli and the removal of inappropriate varieties of these 36. It is characteristic of such organs to process only very small amounts of external stimuli. They take in only tiny bits of the outside world. Perhaps they could be compared to antennae that probed the outside world and withdrew from it each time. At this point I allow myself to touch in passing on a topic deserving of the deepest treatment. Kant's thesis according to which time and space are necessary forms of our thinking can today be subjected to revision in the light of certain psychoanalytic insights. We have ascertained that unconscious mental processes are themselves timeless. 37. This means, first of all, that they were not ordered temporally, that time does not alter anything in them, that the representation of time cannot be given to them. Here are some negative characters that we can only conceive by comparison with conscious mental processes. Our abstract representation of time seems rather to be entirely taken from the way of working of the PCC system, and to correspond to a self-perception of it. Perhaps this mode of operation of the system is equivalent to the adoption of another path for protection against stimuli. I know that these assertions sound very dark, but I cannot do more than limit myself to indications of this kind. We have pointed out here that the living vesicle is endowed with an anti-stimulus protection against the outside world. And we had established that the cortical layer adjacent to it must be differentiated as an organ for the reception of external stimuli. Now, this cortical layer, sensitive, which will later be the CC system, also receives excitations from within, the position of the system between the exterior and the interior, as well as the diversity of the conditions under which it can be influenced from one side and from the other, become decisive for its operation and that of the mental apparatus as a whole. To the outside there is an anti-stimulus protection, and the magnitudes of excitation will activate only in reduced scale, inwards, that is impossible. 39. And the excitations of the deepest strata propagate to the system in a direct manner and to an unreduced extent, at the same time that certain characteristics of its course produce the series of sensations of pleasure and displeasure. It is true that the excitations coming from the interior will be, due to their intensity and other qualitative characteristics, possibly, due to their amplitude, more appropriate to the way the system works than the stimuli that flow from the outside world. 40. But this constellation clearly determines two things: first, the prevalence of sensations of pleasure and displeasure, an indication of processes that occur inside the apparatus, over all external stimuli; the second, a certain orientation of the behavior with respect to internal excitations that produce too great a multiplication of displeasure. Indeed, there will be a tendency to treat them as if they did not act from within, but from outside, in order to be able to apply the defensive means of anti-stimulus protection to them. This is the origin of projection, for which such an important role is reserved in the causation of pathological processes. I have the impression that these last reflections have led us to better understand the rule of the pleasure principle, but we have not yet been able to clarify the cases that contradict it. So let's go one step further. Let us call external excitations that have enough force to pierce the anti-stimulus protection traumatic. I think the concept of trauma calls for that reference to a withdrawal from stimuli that is usually effective. An event such as external trauma will undoubtedly cause an enormous disturbance in the energy economy betrieb of the organism and will put into action all the means of defense. But at first the pleasure principle will be abolished. It will no longer be possible to prevent the mental apparatus from being overwhelmed by large volumes of stimulation. Then, the task posed is rather this other one: dominate the stimulus, psychically bind the volumes of stimulus that penetrated violently in order to lead them, later, to their processing. It is likely that the specific displeasure of bodily pain is due to the fact that the anti-stimulus shield was perforated in a circumscribed area. And then, from this place on the periphery, continuous excitations flow into the central mental apparatus, such as those that could normally only come from within the apparatus. 41. And what kind of reaction of the mental life would we expect in the face of such an intrusion? The cathexis energy is mobilized from everywhere in order to create, in the environment of the point of intrusion, an energetic cathexis of a corresponding level. It produces a huge counter-investment in favor of which all other psychic systems are impoverished, so that the result is an extensive paralysis or lowering of any other psychic operation. With these examples, we try to learn how to buttress our metapsychological guesses on such Vorbild models. From this constellation we infer that a system with a high cathexis in itself is capable of receiving new contributions of flowing energy and transmuting them into quiescent cathexis, that is, psychically binding them. The higher its own quiescent energy, the greater its binding force will also be, and conversely, the lower its investment, the less capable the system will be to receive inflowing energy, and the more violent will be the consequences of a perforation of the anti-stimulus protection such as the one considered. It would be wrong to object to this conception that the increase in investment around the point of intrusion would be explained in a much simpler way by the direct transport of the volumes of excitation entered. If this were the case, the mental apparatus would experience only an increase in their energy investments, and the paralyzing nature of pain would remain unclear, the impoverishment of all other systems. Nor do the very violent discharge effects produced by pain contradict our explanation. In effect, they are fulfilled by way of reflex, that is to say, without the mediation of the psychic apparatus. The imprecise character of all our elucidations, which we call metapsychological, is due, of course, to the fact that we know nothing about the nature of the excitatory process in the elements of the psychic system, nor do we feel authorized to adopt a hypothesis regarding it. Thus, we continuously operate with a large X that we carry over to each new formula. We easily admit that this process is carried out with energies that present quantitative differences, and perhaps it seems likely to us that it also possesses more than one quality, e.g., of the nature of an amplitude, and as a new element we have considered Brewer's conception according to which two different forms of energetic filling energy Earfulian are at stake, cf. AE 18, p. 26, in such a way that it would be necessary to distinguish a cathexis in free flow, which strives towards its release, and a quiescent cathexis of the psychic systems, or their elements. And perhaps we admit the conjecture that the binding of the energy flowing into the mental apparatus consists in a transport from the state of free flow to the quiescent state. I think we can venture to conceive of the common traumatic neurosis as the result of a vast breakdown of anti-stimulus protection. In this way, the old and naive shock doctrine would return, apparently opposed to a later and more psychologically refined doctrine, which does not attribute etiological value to the action of mechanical violence, but to terror and danger of death. Only these opposites are not irreconcilable, nor is the psychoanalytic conception of traumatic neurosis identical with the crudest form of shock theory. While this locates the essence of the shock in the direct deterioration of the molecular or even histological structure of the nervous elements, we seek to understand its effect by breaking the anti-stimulus protection of the mental organ and the tasks that this poses. But terror also retains its value for us. Its condition is the lack of anguished preparation, cf. AE 18, p. 13, number 3, the latter entails the superinvestment of the systems that receive the stimulus first. As a result of this lower cathexis, then, the systems are not in a good position to link the supervening volumes of excitation, and for this reason the consequences of the rupture of the anti-stimulus protection occur all the more easily. Thus, we discover that the anguished readiness, with its overinvestment of recipient systems, constitutes the last trench of anti-stimulus protection. In a whole series of traumas, the decisive factor for the outcome may be the difference between the unprepared systems and those prepared by overinvestment. Of course, after a certain intensity of the trauma, that difference will cease to matter. If in traumatic neurosis dreams so regularly lead the patient back to the situation in which he suffered the accident, it is clear that they are not at the service of wish fulfillment, whose hallucinatory production became the function of dreams under the rule of the pleasure principle. But we are entitled to suppose that in this way they contribute to another task that must be solved before the pleasure principle can begin its empire. These dreams seek to regain dominance. Bewältigung on the stimulus by means of a development of anxiety whose omission caused the traumatic neurosis. They thus provide us with a perspective on a function of the mental apparatus that, without contradicting the pleasure principle, is nevertheless independent of it and seems more original than the purpose of gaining pleasure and avoiding displeasure. Here, then, we should admit for the first time an exception to the thesis that the dream is wish fulfillment. Anxiety dreams are not such an exception, as I have shown repeatedly and in depth, neither are punishment dreams, since they do nothing but replace the forbidden wish fulfillment with the pertinent punishment, and therefore they are the wish fulfillment of the guilty conscience that reacts against the disapproved drive. But the aforementioned dreams of traumatic neurotics can no longer be seen as wish fulfillment, neither are the dreams that appear in psychoanalysis, and that bring back the memory of the psychic traumas of childhood. Rather, they obey the compulsion to repeat, which in analysis is supported by the desire, certainly promoted by suggestion 45, to summon what is forgotten and repressed. Thus, it would not be the original function of the dream to eliminate, through the wish fulfillment of disturbing motions, motives capable of interrupting sleep. It could only appropriate this function after the whole of mental life accepted the rule of the pleasure principle. If there is a beyond the pleasure principle, by obligatory consequence it will be necessary to admit that there was a time previous also to the tendency of the dream to the fulfillment of desire. This does not contradict the function that it will adopt later. But, once the exception to this trend is admitted, another question arises: are dreams of this kind not possible even outside of analysis, that in the interest of the psychic link of traumatic impressions? Do they obey the repetition compulsion? It must be answered entirely in the affirmative. As for the shell shocks, to the extent that this designation denotes something more than the reference to what caused the disease, I have pointed out elsewhere that they could very well be traumatic neuroses facilitated by a conflict in the Me 46. The fact cited above, AE 18, P 12, that the chances of contracting neuroses are reduced when the trauma is accompanied by a physical injury is no longer incomprehensible if one takes into account two constellations that psychoanalytic research has placed highlighted. First, that mechanical shock must be recognized as one of the sources of sexual excitement 47, and second, that the pathological state of fever and pain exerts, while it lasts, a powerful influence on the distribution of libido. Then, the mechanical violence of the trauma would release the quantum of sexual arousal, whose traumatic action is due to the lack of anguished readiness, and, on the other hand, the simultaneous physical injury would link the excess of excitation by demanding a narcissistic superinvestment of the ailing organ 48. It is also known, though not sufficiently appreciated in libido theory, that serious disturbances in the libidinal distribution, such as those of melancholia, are temporarily cancelled out by intercurrent organic disease, and even more, a fully developed precox dementia is capable, under the same condition, of a provisional remission of its condition. 5. The lack of an anti-stimulus protection that protects the stimulus-receiving cortical layer from stimuli from within must have this consequence: such stimulus transfers assume the greatest economic importance and often give rise to economic disturbances comparable to traumatic neuroses. The most beneficial sources of this internal excitement are the so-called drives of the organism, the representatives representant of all the effective forces that come from inside the body and are transferred to the mental apparatus. This is the most important and obscure element of psychological research. Perhaps we do not find it too daring to suppose that the motions that start from the drives do not obey the type of the linked nervous process, but that of the freely mobile process that strives towards the discharge. The best we know about the latter comes from the study of dream work, which allowed us to discover that the processes that go on in unconscious systems are radically different from those that go on in pre-conscious systems, that in the unconscious the cathexes can be transferred, displaced, and condensed in different ways. Complete and easy, which, if it occurred with the preconscious material, could only yield incorrect results. It is what engenders the well-known peculiarities of the manifest dream after the preconscious diurnal remnants have been elaborated in accordance with the laws of the unconscious. I have called the modality of these processes that occur in the unconscious the primary psychic process, as opposed to the secondary process, which governs our normal waking life. Since all instinctual movements affect unconscious systems, it is hardly new to say that they obey the primary psychic process, and on the other hand, from there to identifying the primary psychic process with the freely mobile cathexis, and the secondary process with the alterations of Brewer's tide or tonic cathexis 49, there is only a small step. Then, the task of the superior strata of the mental apparatus would be to link the excitation of the drives that enters into operation in the primary process. The failure of this link would cause a disturbance analogous to traumatic neurosis. Only after a successful link could the unrestricted rule of the pleasure principle, and its modification in the reality principle, be established. But, until that moment, the psychic apparatus would have the previous task of dominating or linking the excitation, certainly not in opposition to the pleasure principle, but independently of it and partly without taking it into account. The expressions of a compulsion to repeat that we have described in the early activities of the infantile mental life, as well as in the experiences of the psychoanalytic treatment, show to a high degree an instinctual character 50 and, where they are in opposition to the pleasure principle, demonic. In the case of the children's game, we believe that the child repeats the unpleasant experience, moreover, because through his activity he achieves a much more radical control over the intense impression than was possible in the merely passive experience. Each new repetition seems to perfect that mastery sought, but not even the repetition of pleasant experiences will be enough for the child, who will be inflexible, demanding the identity of the impression. This character trait is destined to disappear later. A joke heard a second time will have almost no effect. A theatrical performance will never make the impression the second time that it left the first, and it will still be difficult to move an adult to immediately reread a book that he has liked very much. In all cases, novelty will be a condition of jouissance. The child, on the other hand, will not stop asking the adult to repeat a game that the latter taught him or played with him, until the adult, tired, refuses, and if he has been told a nice story, he will always want to hear the same one instead of a new one. He will be adamant about the identity of the repetition, and he will correct any variations that the teller may have incurred and with which he perhaps intended to gain himself. A new merit. None of this contradicts the pleasure principle. It is clear that repetition, the reunion of identity, constitutes by itself a source of pleasure. In the analysand, on the other hand, it is clear that his compulsion to repeat in the transference the episodes of the childhood period of his life lies, in all respects, beyond the pleasure principle. The patient behaves in this in a completely childish manner, and thus teaches us that the repressed memory traces of his experiences of primordial time do not remain within him in the bound state, and are even to a certain extent insusceptible to the secondary process. To this condition of not being linked they also owe their ability to form, by adhering to the remains of the day, a fantasy of desire that finds figuration in dreams. Very often this same compulsion to repeat is a therapeutic hindrance for us when, at the end of the cure, we strive to achieve the patient's complete detachment from his doctor, and it may be supposed that the dark anguish of those unfamiliar with analysis, who are afraid of awakening something that in their opinion would be better left asleep, is at bottom fear of the emergence of this demonic compulsion. Now, how is the drive intertwined with the compulsion to repeat? Here the idea that we are on the trail of a universal character of the drives, until now not clearly recognized, or at least not expressly highlighted, and perhaps of all organic life in general, cannot fail to impose itself on us. A drive would then be an effort, inherent to the living organic, to reproduce a previous state that the living had to resign under the influence of external disturbing forces. It would be a kind of organic elasticity or, if you like, the externalization of inertia in organic life. This way of conceiving the drive sounds strange to us. In effect, we have become accustomed to seeing in the drive the factor that forces in the direction of change and development, and now we are forced to recognize in it exactly the opposite, the expression of the conservative nature of the living being. On the other hand, those phenomena of animal life that seem to corroborate the historical conditioning of the drives immediately come to mind. Certain fish undertake, at the time of spawning, tiring migrations in order to deposit the eggs in certain waters, very far from their habitual place of residence. Many biologists interpret that they are only looking for the previous dwellings of their species, which in the course of time they had exchanged for others. The same is applicable, it is believed, to the migratory flights of birds of passage. Now, a reflection soon frees us from looking for new examples. In the phenomena of heredity and in the facts of embryology we have the maximum documents of the compulsion to repeat in the organic world. We see that the germ of a living animal is obliged to repeat, even if in a fleeting and summarized way, the structures of all the forms from which the animal descends, instead of suddenly reaching its final conformation by the shortest path, and since we can only partially explain this behavior in mechanical terms, it is not lawful for us to dismiss the historical explanation. In the same way, a reproductive capacity 54 is widespread in the animal kingdom, by virtue of which a lost organ is replaced by the neoformation of another that completely resembles it. It is true that a suggestive objection based on the idea that along with the conservative drives, which compel repetition, there are others that strive in the direction of creation and progress, cannot be left out of consideration here. Later we will incorporate it into our Reflections 55. But first, we cannot resist the temptation to follow to its ultimate consequences the hypothesis that all drives want to reproduce something prior. It doesn't matter if what comes out of this has an air of profound or sounds like something mystical. For our part, we know that we are free from the reproach of seeking such a thing. We strive to achieve the sober results of research or reflection based on it, and we do not try to make them have any other character than that of certainty. 56. Well then, if all the organic drives are conservative, historically acquired and directed towards regression, towards the restoration of the former, we will have to write down the successes of organic development in the account of external, disturbing and deviant influences. From its very beginning, the elementary living being would not have wanted to change and, if conditions remain the same, would have always repeated the same course of life. Even more, in the last analysis, what would have left its mark on the evolution of organisms would be the evolutionary history of our Earth and its relations with the Sun. The conservative organic drives have collected. Each one of these variations imposed on its vital course, preserving them in repetition, hence these forces cannot but arouse the deceptive impression that they aspire to change and progress, when in truth they were merely striving to reach an old goal through old and new paths. One could even indicate what this final goal of all organic efforts is. It would contradict the conservative nature of the drives if the goal of life was a state never reached before. Rather, it must be an ancient, initial state, which the living once abandoned and to which it aspires to return by all the detours of evolution. If it is lawful for us to admit as an experience without exceptions that everything alive dies, returns to the inorganic, for internal reasons, we cannot say anything other than this: the goal of all life is death, and, retrospectively, the inanimate was there before the living. At some point, by an intervention of forces that is still entirely unimaginable to us, the properties of life arose in inanimate matter. Perhaps it was a similar process, in terms of its archetype vorbildlich, to that other one that later gave rise to consciousness in a certain stratum of living matter. The tension thus generated in the hitherto inanimate material then struggled to level itself. This is how the first drive was born, that of returning to the inanimate. At that time, it was still easy for the living substance to die. He probably had only a short vital path to follow, the direction of which was marked by the chemical structure of young life. For a long time, perhaps, the living substance was recreated always anew and died easily each time, until decisive external influences so altered that they forced the still surviving substance to deviate more and more from its original life path, and to take more and more complicated detours, before reaching the goal of death. Perhaps it is these detours to reach death, faithfully retained by conservative drives, that today offer us the build picture of vital phenomena. We cannot reach other conjectures about the origin and goal of life if we stick to the idea of the exclusively conservative nature of the drives. As strange as these conclusions sound, what is obtained with respect to the large groups of drives that we establish behind the vital phenomena of organisms? The statute of the self-preservation drives that we assume in every living being presents notable opposition with the presupposition that the drive life as a whole serves the provocation of death. In this light, the theoretical importance of the drives for self-preservation, for power and for being recognized falls to the ground. They are partial drives destined to assure the path towards the peculiar death of the organism and to distance other possibilities of return to the inorganic that are not the imminent ones. This is how the enigmatic eagerness of the organism is volatilized, impossible to insert into an order of coherence, to assert itself in spite of the entire world. Here is what remains: the organism only wants to die in its own way. Also, these guardians of life were originally death halberdiers. Thus the paradox is engendered that the living organism fights with maximum energy against influences, dangers, that could help it to reach its vital goal by the shortest path, by short-circuiting, let's put it that way, but this behavior is precisely what is characteristic of a purely instinctual struggle, as opposed to an intelligent struggle. But let us reflect, that cannot be so. The sexual drives, for which the doctrine of the neuroses has claimed a particular status, are placed in a completely different light. Not all organisms are exposed to the external compulsion that pushes them to ever more advanced development. Many have managed to survive to the present in their lower stage, and today survive, if not all, at least many beings that must be similar to the previous stages of animals and higher plants. And in the same way, not all the elemental organisms that make up the complex body of a higher living being follow their entire path of development until natural death. Some of them, germ cells, probably retain the original structure, leave living substance, and after a certain time they are released from the total organism, loaded with all the inherited and newly acquired instinctual dispositions. Perhaps it is precisely these two properties that make their autonomous existence possible. Placed in favorable conditions, they begin to develop, that is to say, to repeat the game to which they owe their genesis, and the game ends in the fact that one part of its substance continues its development to the end, while another, as a new germinal remnant, goes back to the beginning of development. Thus, these germinal cells work against the death of the living substance and know how to conquer what cannot but appear to us as its potential immortality, although perhaps it only implies a prolongation of the path until death. The fact that it is the fusion of the germinal cell with another, similar to it and yet different, is extremely significant to us. What potentiates it for this operation, or, even more, makes it possible? The drives that watch over the destinies of these elementary organisms that survive the individual, take care of their safe placement as turbring, and while they are defenseless against the stimuli of the outside world, and cause their encounter with the other germ cells, etc., constitute the group of sexual drives. They are conservative in the same sense as the others, insofar as they mirror previous states of the living substance, but they are so to a greater extent, since they are particularly resistant to external interference, and they are also so in another sense, since they preserve life for longer periods. 58. They are the genuine impulses of life, since they contradict the purpose of the other drives, a purpose that through the function leads to death. An opposition is insinuated between the former and the latter, an opposition whose importance was early discerned by the doctrine of the neuroses. There is like a hesitant rhythm in the life of organisms. One of the instinctual groups rushes forward impetuously in order to reach the final goal of life as quickly as possible. The other, having reached a certain point on this path, throws himself backwards to resume it from a certain point and thus prolong the duration of the journey. Now it is true that sexuality and difference of the sexes did not exist at the beginning of life. Despite this, the possibility remains that the drives that would later be called sexual entered into activity from the very beginning, instead of starting their work contrary to the game of the ego drives at a later point in time. But let's stop here for the first time, and ask ourselves if all these speculations are not without foundation. Is there really no other drives, disregarding the sexual drive 60, than those that seek to restore a previous state? Will there not be others who aspire to something not yet achieved? Within the organic world I do not know of any true example that contradicts the proposed characterization. It is certain that in the animal and plant kingdoms the existence of a universal drive towards evolutionary progress is not proven, even though the orientation in that sense continues to be in fact unquestionable. But, on the one hand, Many times it depends only on our subjective appreciation to declare that one stage of development is superior to another, and furthermore, the science of the living shows us that an evolution in one point is very often paid for with an involution in another, or is done at the expense of this point. There are also a good number of animal forms whose juvenile states make us see that their evolution took on a rather regressive character. Both evolutionary progress and involution could be the consequence of external forces that force adaptation, and in both cases the role of the drives could be limited to preserving, as an internal source of pleasure, the imposed alteration. Many of us may find it difficult to renounce the belief that there is a drive for perfection inhabiting human beings that has led them to their current level of spiritual performance and ethical sublimation, and that, it is legitimate to hope, will ensure the transformation from man to Superman. It's just that I don't believe in an internal drive of this nature, and I don't see any way that would allow us to preserve that consoling illusion. It seems to me that the evolution that the human being has had up to now does not require a different explanation than that of the animals, and the indefatigable effort that is observed in a minority of human individuals towards a greater improvement can be understood without violence as a result of the repression of Drive 62, on which the most valuable thing in human culture is built. The repressed drive never ceases to aspire to its full satisfaction, which would consist in the repetition of a primary experience of satisfaction. All the substitutive and reactive formations, and all the sublimations, are insufficient to cancel its pressing tension, and the difference between the pleasure of satisfaction found and the one intended engenders the driving factor, which does not allow clinging to any of the established situations, but instead, in the words of the poet, spurs wild, always forward. 63. The way back, towards full satisfaction, is generally obstructed by the resistances by virtue of which the repressions are maintained, and then all that remains is to advance in the other direction of development, still expeditious, in truth with no prospect of ending the march or reaching the goal. The processes that occur in the development of a neurotic phobia, which by the way is nothing more than an attempt to escape in the face of instinctual satisfaction, provide us with the model of the genesis of this apparent improvement drive, which in no way can we attribute to the totality of human individuals. Undoubtedly, their dynamic conditions pre-exist in all of them, but the economic proportions seem to favor the phenomenon only in rare cases. Let us note in passing the possibility that the eagerness of Eros to combine the organic in larger and larger units acts as a substitute for that drive for improvement that we cannot admit. Together with the effects of repression, this would help to explain the phenomena attributed to it. 64. 6. The conclusion obtained up to this moment, which establishes a sharp opposition between the ego drives and the sexual drives, and according to which the former strive in the direction of death and the latter in the direction of the continuation of life, will undoubtedly prove unsatisfactory in many respects, even for ourselves. Added to this is the fact that only for the former could we claim the conservative character or, better, regressive of the drive that would correspond to a compulsion to repeat. Indeed, according to our assumptions, the ego drives come from the animation of inanimate matter and want to restore the inanimate condition. On the other hand, regarding the sexual drives, it is clear that they reproduce primitive states of the living being, but the goal that they strive to achieve by all means is the fusion of two differentiated germ cells in a certain way. If this union does not occur, the germ cell dies like all the other elements of the multicellular organism. Only under this condition can the reproductive function prolong life and give it the appearance of immortality. Now, what important event occurred in the evolutionary course of the living substance is repeated by genetic reproduction or its precursor? The copulation between two protists. We don't know how to say it, and for this reason, if our entire conceptual edifice were to reveal itself to be wrong, we would feel it as a relief. The opposition between ego drives, death, and sexual drives, life, would fall to the ground, and with it the compulsion to repeat would also lose the meaning attributed to it. Let us return, then, to one of the assumptions that we have inserted, with the hope of being able to refute it entirely. We have built further conclusions on the premise that every living being has to die from internal causes. If we adopt this assumption so carelessly, it was because it did not seem so to us. We are used to thinking like this, and our poets corroborate us in it. Perhaps the consolation implicit in that belief induced us to do this. If oneself is destined to die, and before that they must lose their loved ones by death, they will prefer to be subject to an incontrovertible natural law, the sublime Santanic necessity, and not to a contingency that perhaps could have been avoided. But this belief in the internal legality of dying may be nothing more than one of the illusions that we have engendered to endure the pains of existence. 67. This belief is certainly not original. Primitive peoples are unaware of the idea of a natural death. They attribute any death that occurs among them to the influence of an enemy or an evil spirit. That is why we must without fail turn to biological science to test this belief. If we do, we will be astonished at how little agreement exists among biologists on the problem of natural death. Even more, the very concept of death falls apart in their hands. The fact that at least the life of the higher animals has a certain average duration argues, of course, in favor of death from internal causes, but this impression is again dissipated by the fact that certain large animals and gigantic trees reach an age very high, which until now has not been estimated. According to the grandiose conception of W. Flies 1906, all the vital phenomena of organisms including their death, of course are subject to the fulfillment of certain terms in which the dependence of two living substances is expressed, one masculine and one feminine, with respect to the solar year. However, observations about the ease and extent with which the influences of external forces are capable of altering the temporal emergence of vital manifestations, particularly from the plant kingdom, anticipating or delaying them, resist their insertion within the rigid formulas of Flies and make it doubtful, at least, that the laws postulated by him have exclusive predominance. The treatment that the subject of the duration of life and death of organisms has received in the works of A. Weismann, 1882, 1884, 1892, among others, is of great interest to us. To this investigator is due the differentiation of the living substance into a mortal half and an immortal half. The mortal is the body in the strict sense, the soma, only she is subject to natural death. But germ cells are potentially immortal, insofar as they are capable, under certain favorable conditions, of developing into a new individual, in other words, of surrounding themselves with a new soma. What captivates us here is the unexpected analogy with our conception, developed in such different ways. Weismann, in a morphological approach to the living substance, discerns in it a pronounced component towards death, the soma, the body except for the genetic material and relative to heredity, and another immortal component, precisely that germinal plasm that serves the conservation of life. The species, to reproduction. For our part, we have not dealt with the living substance but with the forces that act on it, and we found ourselves led to distinguish two kinds of drives, those that seek to lead life to death, and the others, the sexual drives, which continuous aspire to the renewal of life, and they carry it out. This sounds like a dynamic corollary to Weismann's morphological theory. But the illusion of a meaningful agreement is dispelled as soon as we learn of Weismann's judgment on the problem of death. In effect, he makes the distinction between mortal soma and immortal germplasm valid only for multicellular organisms. On the other hand, in unicellular animals, the individual and the reproduction cell are one and the same thing. 69. That is why he declares the latter potentially immortal. Death appears only among the metazoans, the multicellular ones. This death of higher living beings is, yes, a natural death, the product of internal causes, but it does not rest on an original property of the living substance. 70. It cannot be understood as an absolute necessity, founded on the nature of life. Death is rather a mechanism of convenience with Massigkeit, a phenomenon of adaptation to external vital conditions, because from the moment the cells of the body divided into soma and germinal plasm, an unlimited duration of individual life, it would have become a purposeless luxury uns with Massig. The emergence of this differentiation in multicellulars made death possible and suitable for purposes. Since then, the soma of higher living beings has died for internal reasons at determined periods, but the protists have remained immortal. Reproduction, on the other hand, was not introduced only with death, rather it is a primordial property of living matter, like the growth from which it came, and life has continued without interruption since it began on Earth. It is easy to see that the admission of a natural death of higher organisms helps us little in our subject. If death is a late acquisition of the living being, we can no longer speak of death drives that would derive from the beginning of life on Earth. And then, that multicellular animals die for internal reasons, whether due to defective differentiation or the imperfect nature of their metabolism, is of no interest for the problem at hand. On the other hand, this conception and derivation of death is much more akin to the habitual thought of men than the strange assumption of death drives. In my opinion, the discussion that Weismann's theses gave rise to was not conclusive in any way. Many authors return to the point of view of Goethe, 1883, who saw death as the direct consequence of reproduction. Hartmann does not characterize it by the emergence of a corpse, of a deceased part of the living substance, but defines it as the closure of individual development. In this sense, protozoa are also deadly. Death in them always coincides with reproduction, but to a certain extent it is veiled by the latter, since all the substance of the parent animal can be transmitted directly to the young individuals, their children. The interest of the investigation was soon directed to submit to experimental proof the asserted immortality of the living substance in unicellular animals. An American, Woodruff, made a culture of a ciliate infusoria, known as the little animal in slippers, which reproduces by dividing into two individuals. He followed it until generation number 3029, when he interrupted the experiment, each time taking one of the products of the partition and putting it in fresh water. Well then, that last offspring of the first slippered animal was as young as its ancestor, with no sign of aging or degeneration. Thus, if the figures reached are already probative, it would seem experimentally demonstrable the immortality of protists. Other researchers have reached different results. Malpass, Calkins, and others have found, in opposition to Woodruff, that these infusorians, too, after a certain number of divisions, weaken, diminish in size, lose a part of their organization, and finally die unless they receive certain renewing influences. They then maintain that, after a phase of aging, the protozoa die, just like the higher animals. Thus they contradict the theses of Weismann, for whom death is a late acquisition of living organisms. From the set of these investigations we have to extract two facts that seem to offer us a firm footing. In the first place, if the little animals, at a time when they still do not show any sign of senescence, can merge in pairs, copulate and separate again after a certain period they are safe from aging, they rejuvenate. This copulation is undoubtedly the precursor of the genetic reproduction of the higher animals. It still has nothing to do with multiplication, it is limited to the mixture of the substances of the two individuals, Weismann's amphimixis. However, the renewing influence of copulation can also be replaced by certain stimulations, alterations in the composition of the nutritive liquid, increase in temperature or shaking. Remember the famous experiment by J. Loeb, who, thanks to certain chemical stimuli, forced division processes in sea urchin eggs, processes that normally only occur after fertilization. Secondly, it is probable, however, that the infusoria are led to a natural death by their own life process. Indeed, the contradiction between Woodruff's results and those of other researchers is due to the fact that the former put each new generation in a renewed nutritive liquid. When he omitted to do so, he observed the same aging of the generations as the other researchers. He inferred that the little animals were damaged by the metabolic products that they released into the surrounding liquid, and was then able to show convincingly that only the products of their own metabolism had this effect, which leads to the death of the generation. Indeed, in a solution supersaturated with the waste products of a distantly related species, these same little animals flourished remarkably, which, deposited in their own nutritive liquid, would surely perish. Left to itself, then, the infusoria dies a natural death from the imperfect elimination of its own metabolic products, but perhaps all higher animals die, deep down, from that same incapacity. This doubt may assail us: is it ultimately wise to seek the answer to the problem of natural death in the study of protozoa? Perhaps the primitive organization of these beings hides from us important constellations that also appear in them but that can only be recognized in higher animals, where they have sought a morphological expression. If we abandon the morphological point of view in order to adopt the dynamic one, we may be completely indifferent whether or not the natural death of protozoa is demonstrated. In them, the substance later recognized as immortal has not yet been in any way separated from the mortal substance. The instinctual forces that want to transport life to death could also act in them from the beginning, and yet their effect could be so hidden by the forces of the preservation of life that its direct demonstration would become very difficult. On the other hand, we have already said that the observations of biologists allow us to suppose that kind of internal processes that lead to death in protists as well. But even if protists turn out to be immortal in Weismann's sense, his thesis that death is a late acquisition holds only for overt manifestations of death and does not enable any assumptions to be made about the processes that push toward it. Our expectation that biology would throw out recognition of the death drive has not been fulfilled. We may continue to pursue its possibility if we have other grounds for doing so. In any case, the striking similarity between Weismann's separation between soma and germinal plasm, and our division between death drives and life drives, stands and regains its value. Let's dwell a little on this eminently dualistic conception of instinctual life. According to Ewald Hering's Theory of Living Substance 1878, pages 77 and 6, in it two classes of processes of opposite orientation run continuously, one of anabolism assimilatory and the other of catabolism disassimilatory. Will we dare to discern in these two orientations of the vital processes the activity of our two drive motions, the life drive and the death drive? And there is another thing that we cannot hide: we have inadvertently arrived at the port of Schopenhauer's philosophy, for whom death is the genuine result and, to that extent, the end of life. 76, while the sexual drive is the incarnation of the will to live. Let's rehearse, coldly, go one step further. It is a general opinion that the union of numerous cells in a society, vital, the multicellular character of organisms, constitutes a means for the prolongation of their life. One cell helps to preserve the life of the others, and that cellular state can survive even if some of its cells die. We already know that copulation, the temporary fusion of two unicellular beings, causes a rejuvenating and life-preserving effect on both. This being the case, one could attempt to transfer the theory of libido elaborated by psychoanalysis to the reciprocal relationship between cells. We would then imagine that the life or sexual drives, active in each cell, are the ones that take the other cells as their object, partially neutralizing their death drives, that is, the processes provoked by the latter, and thus keeping them in control. Life, at the same time, other cells do the same to the former, and still others sacrifice themselves in the exercise of this libidinous function. As for the germ cells, they would behave in an absolutely narcissistic, according to the designation we usually use in the doctrine of neuroses, when a total individual retains his libido within the ego and spends none of it on object cathexes. The germ cells need their libido, the activity of their life drives, for themselves, as a reserve, with a view to their subsequent activity, of great anabolic dimension. Perhaps the cells of malignant neoplasms that destroy the organism should be declared narcissistic in this same sense. In effect, pathology is prepared to consider its germs congenital and attribute embryonic properties to them. 77. In this way, the libido of our sexual drives would coincide with the eros of the poets and philosophers, the eros that unites all living things. At this point we have the opportunity to take a panoramic view of the slow development of our theory of the libido. In the beginning, the analysis of the transference neuroses compelled us to establish the opposition between the sexual drives, which are directed towards the object, and other drives, which we discerned in a very unsatisfactory way and provisionally called ego drives 78. Among them we should have recognized, in the first line, drives that serve the self-preservation of the individual. Nothing more could be ascertained as to other necessary distinctions. To lay the foundations of a correct psychology, no other knowledge would have been as important as an approximate understanding of the common nature and eventual particularities of the drives. But in no field of psychology was one so groping. Each one established a certain number of drives or basic drives at will, and then administered them as the ancient Greek natural philosophers did with their four elements: water, earth, fire, and air. Psychoanalysis, which could not dispense with some hypothesis about the drives, initially adhered to the popular differentiation whose paradigm is the phrase for hunger and for love. Thus, at least, he did not incur in a new arbitrariness. And this allowed us to go a long way in the analysis of psychoneuroses. The concept of sexuality and with it, that of the sexual drive could not help but extend to many things that were not subordinated to the reproduction function, which caused great scandal in a rigid, respectable, or merely hypocritical society. The next step was taken when psychoanalysis was able to get a closer look at the psychological self, of which at the beginning it had only been aware of as a repressive, censoring instance, empowered to erect protective fences and reaction formations. Critical spirits and others with a broad outlook had objected for some time, it is true, that the concept of libido was restricted to the energy of the object-directed sexual drives. But they omitted to communicate where their best understanding came from, and they failed to derive from it anything usable for analysis. Now, it called the attention of psychoanalytic observation, in its careful progress, the regularity with which the libido was removed from the object and directed to the ego, introversion, and, studying the libidinal development of the child in its earliest phases, he came to the insight that the ego was the genuine and original reservoir of the libido, which only extended from there to the object. The ego became part of the sexual objects, and the most exalted of them was immediately discerned in it. The libido was called narcissistic when it remained like this within the ego 81. Of course, this narcissistic libido was also an externalization of sexual drive forces in the analytical sense, but it had to be identified with the self-preservation drives admitted from the very beginning. In this way, the original opposition between ego drives and sexual drives became insufficient. A part of the ego drives was recognized as libidinous, sexual drives also acted inside the ego, along with others, probably. And despite this, it is authorized to say that the old formula according to which psychoneurosis consists of a conflict between ego drives and sexual drives does not contain anything that should be dismissed today. Simply, the difference between both varieties of drives, which originally had been understood with some qualitative inflection, now had to be defined in another way, namely, topic. Transference neurosis, in particular, the genuine object of study of psychoanalysis, remained the result of a conflict between the ego and the libidinous object cathexis. We are all the more forced to emphasize the libidinal character of the self-preservation drives now, since we dare to take another step, to discern the sexual drive as the eros that preserves everything, and to derive the narcissistic libido of the ego from the libidinal contributions with soma cells adhere to each other. Well then, suddenly we are faced with this problem: if the drives for self-preservation are also of a libidinous nature, perhaps we have no other drives than the libidinous ones. To the less, no others are seen. But then it is necessary to agree with the critics who from the beginning suspected that psychoanalysis explained everything by sexuality, or with the innovators like Jung, who not long ago decided to use libido with the meaning of drive force. In general. Isn't that so? To begin with, this result was not in our intentions. Rather, we have started from a sharp separation between ego drives equals death drives, and sexual drives equals life drives. We were already ready cf. AE, 18, pages 38 to 9 to compute the supposed drives for self-preservation of the ego among the death drives, from which we later refrained, correcting ourselves. Our conception was dualistic from the beginning, and it is even more emphatically so today, when we have stopped calling the opposite ego drives and sexual drives, to give them the name of life drives and death drives. In contrast, Jung's theory of the libido is monistic. The fact that he called his only instinctual force libido must have sown confusion, but it should not influence us further. 82. We conjecture that drives other than those for libidinous self-preservation act inside the ego, only we should be able to indicate them. It is unfortunate that it is very difficult for us to do so, due to the backwardness of the analysis of the self. Perhaps the libidinal drives of the ego are linked in a particular way with those other ego drives that we still do not know. Even before clearly discerning narcissism, psychoanalysis conjectured that the ego drives have attracted libidinous components to themselves. But these are very uncertain possibilities, and it is difficult for our opponents to take them into account. It remains annoying that up to now analysis has only allowed us to investigate libidinous ego drives. But this would not support the inference that there are no others. Given the obscurity that today surrounds the doctrine of the drives, we would not do well to dismiss occurrences that promised us clarification. We have started from the great opposition between life drives and death drives. Object love itself teaches us a second polarity of this kind, the one that mediates between love, tenderness, and hate, aggression. If only we were able to put these two polarities in reciprocal relation, to lead one to the other. Since we have always recognized a sadistic component in the sexual drive. 84, as far as we know, it can become autonomous and govern, as a perversion, the person's integral sexual aspiration. And it even stands out, as a dominant partial drive, in one of what I have called pregenital organizations. Now, how could we derive from eros, the preservative of life, the sadistic drive, which aims to harm the object? Is it not possible to suppose that this sadism is really a death drive separated from the ego by the effort and the influence of the narcissistic libido, so that it comes to light only in the object? Then it enters the service of the sexual function. In the stage of oral organization of the libido, the seizing of love still coincides with the annihilation of the object. Later on, the sadistic drive separates and ultimately takes on, in the stage of genital primacy governed by the end of reproduction, the function of dominating the sexual object to the extent that it is required by the execution of the reproductive act. And it could even be said that the sadism forced out Beraz-Drangen of the ego has shown the way to the libidinous components of the sexual drive, which, in pursuit of it, strive to hunt Nachdrangen for the object. Where the original sadism has not undergone any tempering or fusion, Verschmelzung, the well-known love-hate ambivalence of love life is established. If it is legitimate to make such an assumption, the requirement of indicating an example of a death drive, it is true that displaced descentaerd, would have been fulfilled. Only this conception is very far from all evidence, and produces a directly mystical impression. The suspicion falls on us that we would have searched at all costs for a file to get out of a state of great perplexity. But we have the right to invoke that such an assumption is not new, that we already did it once before, when there was no question of perplexity. Clinical observations imposed this conception on us at the time. Masochism, the complementary partial drive of sadism, must be understood as a reversal Rückwendung of sadism towards one's own self. Now, a return-wendung of the drive from the object to the ego is, in principle, nothing other than the return from the ego to the object that here appears to us as something new. Masochism, the return of the drive towards one's own self, would then, in reality, be a regression to a previous phase of that one, a regression. The exposition that we made of masochism at that time would need be amended on one point, for being too exclusive, there could also be a primary masochism, something that in that place I wanted to call into question. 87. But let us return to the conservative sexual drives of life. The investigation of protists has already taught us that the fusion of two individuals without division subsequent to their separation, that is, copulation, produces a strengthening and rejuvenating effect on both, once again detached. 88. In successive generations they do not show any degenerative phenomenon, and seem able to resist the deterioration of their own metabolism for longer. I believe that this particular observation can also be taken as a model of the effect produced by the genetic union. But how does the fusion of two poorly differentiated cells cause such a renewal of life? The experiment consisting of substituting copulation, in the case of protozoa, by chemical and even mechanical stimuli allows us to give a sure answer: it occurs by the contribution of new magnitudes of stimulus. Now, this harmonizes with the assumption that the vital process of the individual leads for internal reasons to the leveling of chemical tensions, that is, to death, while the union with a living substance that conforms to a different individual increases these tensions. It introduces new vital differences, so to speak, which then have to be lived out abelbon. As regards these differences, there must, of course, be one or more optimums. And since we have discerned as the dominant tendency of mental life, and perhaps of nervous life in general, that of lowering, keeping constant, suppressing the internal stimulus tension, the nirvana principle, according to Barbara Lowe's terminology 1920, page 73, of which the pleasure principle 89 is an expression, this constitutes one of our strongest reasons for believing in the existence of death drives. However, we continue to feel that it is a notable stumbling block for our argument that we cannot investigate, precisely with respect to the sexual drive, that character of compulsion to repeat that put us on the track of the death drives. It is true that in the field of embryonic evolutionary processes such phenomena of repetition abound, and that the two germinal cells of genetic reproduction and their vital history are not, in turn, but repetitions of the principles of organic life. But what is essential in the processes on which the sexual drive operates is the fusion of two cellular bodies. Only by virtue of it is the immortality of the living substance ensured in higher living beings. In other words, we must procure information about the origin of genetic reproduction and of sexual drives in general, a task that a layman cannot help but recoil from, and which specialized researchers themselves have not been able to resolve until today. For this reason, of all the indications and opinions found, we will highlight, in a tight synthesis, what admits of being linked to our argument. There is a conception that strips the problem of reproduction of its secret charm, presenting it as a partial phenomenon of growth, multiplication by division, by renewal, by gemiparity. In a soberly Darwinian spirit, the genesis of reproduction by sexually differentiated germ cells could thus be conceived: the advantage of amphimixis, achieved at a certain moment by the chance copulation of two protists, was maintained for a long time. Time in evolution and later took advantage of it. 90. Sex would then not be very old, and the extraordinarily violent drives that want to produce sexual union would repeat something that once happened by chance and later took hold because it was advantageous. The same as after death, cf. AE 18, p. 48. The problem arises here: is it necessary to suppose in protists only what they show? Can it not be conjectured that forces and processes were first born in them that only became visible in higher living beings? The aforementioned conception of sexuality serves very little for our purposes. It could be objected that it presupposes the existence of life drives that are already at work in the simplest living being; otherwise, in effect, copulation, which counteracts the vital course and makes the task of living abelbon difficult, would not have been maintained and developed, but rather avoided. So, if we do not want to abandon the hypothesis of the death drives, we must associate them from the very beginning with some life drives. But it must be confessed, we work there with an equation of two unknowns. What we find in science about the genesis of sexuality is so little that this problem can be compared to a dark room where not even the glimpse of a hypothesis has penetrated. It is true that we find such a hypothesis in a completely different place, but it is of such a fantastic nature, by the way, more a myth than a scientific explanation, that I would not dare to mention it if it did not precisely fulfill a condition whose fulfillment we long for. This hypothesis derives a drive from the need to restore a previous state. I am referring, of course, to the theory that Plato has developed in the Banquet by Aristophanes, and which not only deals with the origin of the sexual drive, but also with its most important variation with respect to the object. Once, indeed, our nature it was not identical to what we see today, but of a different sort. No, first of all, that humanity comprised 3 genders, and not 2, male and female, as today. No, there was also a third party, who had the other 2 together, the androgynous. Now, in these human beings, everything was double, they therefore had 4 hands and 4 feet, 2 faces, double genitalia, etc. Then Zeus was determined to divide all human beings into 2 parts as quinces are cut to make preserves. The sectioning had unfolded the natural being. Then each half, sighing for its other half, joined him, they embraced with their hands, they entwined with each other, longing to merge into a single being. Where the emergence of the universe from the Atman, the self or I, is described. But he, the Atman, the self or I, had no joy. Indeed, one has no joy when one is alone. That's why I longed for a second. And he was as big as a woman and a man linked together. And he divided the self of his into 2 parts, from there husband and wife were born. That is why this body is in the self, as it were, a separate half, as Yajnavalkya said. That is why this empty space, here, is filled by the woman. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad is the oldest of all the Upanishads, and no competent scholar places it later than 800 BC. C. Approximate. Opposing the prevailing opinion, I would not give an outright negative answer to the question of whether Plato could return this Hindu idea, even mediately. Indeed, such a possibility cannot be questioned with respect to the doctrine of the transmigration of souls. But even if that dependency were established, through the Pythagoreans, the conceptual coincidence would hardly lose significance. Indeed, Plato would not have endorsed this idea that the Oriental tradition could bring him, and even less would he have given it such an important place, if in his opinion it did not contain a kernel of truth. In a methodical essay devoted to exploring this idea in the pre-Plato period, Ziegler, 1913, traces it back to Babylonian representations. Freud had already alluded to the Platonic myth in his 3 essays 1905 d. AE, 7, p. 124. Will we venture, following the indication of the Noeta philosopher, the hypothesis that the living substance was torn, as a result of its animation, into small particles that since then aspire to reunite through the sexual drives. And that these drives, in which the chemical affinity of inanimate matter persists, gradually overcome, throughout the kingdom of protists, the difficulties posed to this aspiration by an environment loaded with stimuli that endanger life, medium that forces the formation of a protective cortical layer? That these dispersed particles of living substance thus reach the multicellular state and finally transfer to the germ cells, in supreme concentration, the drive to reunite. This is, I think, the point at which we must interrupt. No, however, without adding a few words of critical reflection. I might be asked whether and to what extent I am convinced of the hypotheses developed here. My answer would be, I am not convinced myself, nor do I ask others to believe in them. It seems to me that the effective factor of conviction has nothing to do here. It is fully licit to indulge in an argument, to pursue it as far as it leads, just out of scientific curiosity or, if you like, as an advocatus diaboli who has not given his soul to the devil for that reason. I am not unaware that the third step of the doctrine of the drives, the one that I undertake here, cannot claim the same certainty as the 2 previous ones, namely, the expansion of the concept of sexuality and the thesis of narcissism. Those innovations were direct transpositions of observation into theory, they did not suffer from sources of error greater than those unavoidable in such cases. The affirmation of the regressive character of the drives also rests, it is true, on an observed material, namely, the facts of the compulsion to repeat. Only perhaps I have overestimated its importance. In any case, it is only possible to carry this idea to the end by combining several times, in succession, the factual with the merely incogitated, which takes us a long way from observation. It is known that the final result will be less reliable the more times this is done while building a theory, but the degree of uncertainty cannot be indicated. It may be that the port has been reached successfully, or that little by little it has fallen into error. For such jobs, I don't rely much on so-called intuition. What I have seen of her seems to me rather the achievement of a certain impartiality of the intellect. Only, unfortunately, one is rarely impartial when it comes to the ultimate things, the great problems of science and of life. I believe that everyone is dominated by preferences deeply rooted in their interiority, which, without being aware of it, are those that are put into action when they speculate. There being such good reasons for distrust, one can only adopt a cold benevolence towards the results of one's own conceptual effort. I only hasten to add that such self-criticism in no way compels a particular tolerance for divergent opinions. One can uncompromisingly refute theories that are contradicted from the first steps that one takes in the analysis of observation, and despite this one can know that the correction of the ones one supports is only provisional. In judging our speculation about the life and death drives, we will hardly worry if such strange and unimaginable processes appear in it as one drive being forced out by another, or turning from the ego to the object, and the like. This is only due to the fact that we are forced to work with scientific terms, that is, with the figurative language of images proper to psychology, more correctly, depth psychology. Otherwise we could not even describe the corresponding phenomena, furthermore, we would not even have perceived them. It is probable that the defects of our description would disappear if instead of the psychological terms we could already use the physiological or chemical ones. But in truth these also belong to a figurative language, although it has been familiar to us for a longer time and is perhaps simpler. On the other hand, let us note well that the uncertainty of our speculation was greatly increased by the need to borrow from biological science. Biology is truly a realm of limitless possibilities. We have to wait for the most surprising clarifications from her, and we cannot envision the answers that decades later she will give to the questions that we put to her. Perhaps he will give them such that they will bring down our whole artificial edifice of hypothesis. But if so, you might ask yourself, why take jobs like the ones listed in this section, and why communicate them at the same time? Well then, it's just that I can't deny that some of the analogies, links pointed out in it seemed worthy of consideration. 7. If it really is such a general character of the drives to want to restore a previous state, we cannot be surprised that in mental life so many processes are consumed independently of the pleasure principle. Perhaps this character is communicated to all partial drives. In these, it would be a matter of recovering a certain station on the path of development. But from the fact that the pleasure principle has not yet received any power over all that, it does not follow that all that must be in opposition to it, and the task of determining the relationship of the instinctual processes of repetition with the rule of the pleasure principle remains unresolved. We have discerned as one of the earliest and most important functions of the psychic apparatus that of binding the instinctual movements that come to it, of substituting the primary process that governs them by the secondary process, of transmuting their freely mobile cathexis energy into predominantly quiescent cathexis. Tonic. In the course of this transposition it is not possible to notice the development of displeasure, but this does not mean that the pleasure principle is abrogated. The transposition occurs rather in the service of the pleasure principle. The binding is a preparatory act that introduces and ensures the rule of the pleasure principle. Let's separate function and trend more emphatically than up to now. The pleasure principle is then a tendency that is at the service of a function, that of making the mental apparatus exempt from excitation, or that of keeping the amount of excitation constant, or at the minimum possible level. We still cannot decide for any of these versions with certainty, but we note that the function defined in this way would participate in the most universal aspiration of all living things to go back to the rest of the inorganic world. We have all experienced that the maximum pleasure available to us, that of the sexual act, is linked to the momentary extinction of extreme excitement. Now then, the linkage of the instinctual motion would be a preparatory function destined to accommodate the excitation to later process it definitively in the pleasure of discharge. Within this same order of considerations, we wonder if the sensations of pleasure and displeasure can be produced in the same way by the linked and non-linked excitatory processes. Let us add here a few words intended to clarify our terminology, which in the course of these elucidations has had a certain development. We knew what the sexual drives were because of their relationship with the sexes and with the reproductive function. And later we kept that name when the results of psychoanalysis forced us to loosen the link between those drives and reproduction. With the thesis of the narcissistic libido and the extension of the concept of libido to the individual cell, the sexual drive became eros for us, which tries to force the parts of the living substance towards each other and unite them, and the commonly called sexual instincts appeared as the part of this eros turned towards the object. According to speculation, this eros acts from the beginning of life and, as the life drive, enters into opposition with the death drive, born by the animation of the inorganic. Speculation then seeks to solve the enigma of life through the hypothesis of these two drives that have been fighting each other since the origins. Added in 1921, less comprehensible is perhaps the change undergone by the concept of ego instincts. Originally we called all those instinctual orientations that were less familiar to us, that could be differentiated from the object-directed sexual instincts, we put the ego drives in opposition to the sexual drives, whose expression is the libido. Later we entered into the analysis of the ego and we discerned that a part of the ego drives is also of a libidinous nature and has taken the ego itself as its object. These narcissistic self-preservation drives must have been counted, then, among the libidinous sexual drives. The opposition between ego drives and sexual drives became that which mediates between ego drives and object drives, both of a libidinous nature. But in its place a new opposition arose between libidinal drives, ego and object, and others that have to be established within the ego and perhaps can be investigated in the destructive drives. Speculation turned this opposition into the one that mediates between life drives, eros, and death drives. Linked. For it seems beyond any doubt that the unbound processes, the primary processes, cause much more intense sensations in both directions than the bound ones, those of the secondary process. Furthermore, the primary processes are the earliest in time, at the beginning of mental life there are no others, and we can infer that if the pleasure principle did not already act in them, it could never have been established for later ones. We thus arrive at a result that is not at all simple. The desire for pleasure manifests itself at the beginning of mental life with greater intensity than later, but not so unrestrictedly. He is forced to admit frequent breakups. In times of greater maturity, the rule of the pleasure principle is much more assured, but it itself has not been able to escape control any more than the other drives. In any case, that which in the excitatory process gives rise to the sensations of pleasure and displeasure must be present in the secondary process as well as in the primary. This would be the point at which further studies would have to be initiated. Our consciousness transmits to us from within not only the sensations of pleasure and displeasure, but also those of a peculiar tension that, in turn, can be pleasant or unpleasant. Now, are we to understand that by means of these sensations we differentiate the processes of bound and unbound energy, or does the sensation of tension have to refer to the absolute magnitude, eventually to the level of cathexis, while the pleasure-displeasure series points to the change of the cathexis magnitudes within the unit of time? 93. It also has to call our attention that the life drives have much more to do with our internal perception. Indeed, they are presented as unruly, incessantly bringing tensions whose processing is felt as pleasure, while the death drives seem to carry out their work inadvertently. The pleasure principle seems to be directly at the service of the death drives. It is true that it also stands guard in relation to external stimuli, appreciated as dangers by the two kinds of drives, but very particularly in relation to increases in stimuli from within, which aim to make the task of living more difficult. Here are other problems, innumerable, to which it is not yet possible to answer. But we must be patient and wait for the investigation to have other means and other occasions. You also have to be prepared to abandon a path that you followed for a while, if it doesn't seem to lead to anything good. Only believers who ask science for a substitute for the abandoned catechism will reproach the researcher who reshapes or even reduce their points of view. As for the rest, a poet, Ruckert, consoles us for the slow progress with which our scientific knowledge progresses. What cannot be taken by flying must be reached with a limp. And beyond the pleasure principle. Sigmund Freud.